Inside the storm-lit halls of Congress, as 74 press outlets scrambled for position and 6.2 million Americans watched live, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General now cornered by accusations of selling justice to the highest bidder. Clutching a folder stamped top-level collusion, Jasmine didn't flinch. She unleashed a wave of evidence, emails, secret calls, closed-door deals, that detonated Bondi's carefully crafted reputation in under 90 seconds. Gasps echoed through the chamber, jaws dropped, and for the first time in her career, Bondi had no words. What explosive truth did Jasmine reveal that shattered a political empire on live television? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The vaulted ceilings of the congressional hearing room seemed to press down like judgment itself, heavy and inescapable. Reporters lined the back wall, their lenses locked on a single figure seated behind a stark wooden desk. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. She was no stranger to pressure, nor to power, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just speaking for her constituents. She was standing against a machine of silence, wealth, and political protection that had let one woman rise untouched for years. Before her sat Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, flanked by attorneys, calm, composed, and flint-eyed. But behind that composure lay a legacy of quiet deals and corporate favors, one that Crockett was about to pull into the light. The hearing was packed, not just with politicians and aides, but with survivors. Families affected by polluted land deals, displaced renters from Bondi-protected housing developments, and advocates who had waited years for accountability. Jasmine adjusted her mic, her fingers hovering over the evidence folder like a trigger. She knew what she was up against: decades of political insulation, donor networks, legal ambiguity, but she also knew one thing Bondi never counted on: that someone would dare speak plainly, publicly, and without fear. And as the chamber fell silent beneath the weight of her presence, Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward. No longer just a congresswoman, but a reckoning wrapped in precision. She gripped the edge of the podium like it was holding her back from unleashing something deeper, something personal. "This hearing is not a routine procedure," she began, her voice steady, rich with conviction. "It's a confrontation with a system that has protected the powerful and punished the poor. Today we examine how one woman, Pam Bondi, used the authority of her office not as a shield for the people, but as armor for corporate interests. And while she smiled at press conferences and pledged justice, backroom deals were being made that left families sick, evicted, and voiceless. Her words cut through the room like cold steel. She paused, not for drama, but for the weight of truth to settle. This is what happens when public trust becomes a private asset, when the role of Attorney General becomes a tool to protect donors instead of citizens. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't need to. Every sentence dropped like a gavel. This isn't about one scandal. It's about a pattern, a betrayal, and yes, an emblem of the moral decay that festers when power is left unchecked. Then with surgical calm, she lifted a thick folder labeled Exhibit 1A and opened it before the room. "Let's start with what we can prove," she said, sliding a page into the projector. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a detailed campaign finance chart. Names, dates, amounts. Between 2014 and 2018, Pam Bondi received over $235,000 in bundled donations, Jasmine stated, tapping her finger on the screen. Not from small-town constituents, not from public servants, but from oil lobbyists, real estate magnates, and corporate legal funds, all with active business before her office. The tension in the room tightened. She continued, flipping to another page, an internal memo with a redacted signature. "Here," she said, "is a directive from Bondi's senior counsel suggesting a pause on a zoning lawsuit filed against a luxury developer. Just 72 hours after that same developer hosted a $25,000 a plate fundraiser for her re-election." Eyes widened. Gasps slipped from the press pool. "That's not governance," Jasmine said, her voice sharpening. "That's pay to delay justice." She looked at Bondi for the first time, directly, unwavering. "We're not here to speculate. We are here to account. And Ms. Bondi, this is only the beginning. And if campaign donations were the smoke, then what came next was the inferno buried beneath it. Decades in the making, globally felt and politically protected. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch as she held up a new document. Its header stamped with the seal of the Florida Attorney General's office, its body consisting of only a few chilling paragraphs. Her voice dropped just a fraction, calm but barbed with gravity. In 2016, when the states of New York and Massachusetts took historic steps to hold ExxonMobil accountable for what they allegedly knew, what their own scientists knew, about climate change, Pam Bondi had a choice. She could have stood with transparency, with science, with the truth. Instead, she signed this. She turned and gestured to the projection screen behind her, now displaying the infamous joint letter, signed by more than 10 state attorneys general, including Bondi, demanding an end to the investigation into ExxonMobil's internal research and public deception. "Let me be very clear," Jasmine said, pacing to the center of the floor. While entire coastal communities were preparing for rising tides, while asthma rates spiked in black and brown neighborhoods living near refinery corridors, while entire states faced drought, fire, and food insecurity, Pam Bondi used her office not to demand justice, but to silence it. She clicked to the next slide, now showing quotes from major publications. The Guardian calling it a coordinated assault on climate accountability. The New York Times reporting, state AG's pressure appears to drop Exxon probe. Inside Climate News stating flatly, this is about loyalty to industry, not to citizens. The screen faded into an image of South Florida's eroded shoreline, homes teetering at the edge of collapse. "Do you know what ExxonMobil's internal memos said back in the 1970s? Jasmine asked, looking across the chamber. They knew. They knew that fossil fuels would melt polar ice, raise sea levels, and displace millions. But they buried the truth. Then came the lawsuits, and then came the protectors." She pointed at Bondi. "People like her." The room held its breath. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And when the people's watchdog became the industry's guard dog, we didn't just lose faith. We lost years we'll never get back. But just as the silence in the room began to feel like justice taking form, Pam Bondi leaned into her microphone and twisted the tension back, wrapping it in the polish of practiced denial. She sat upright, spine straight, expression unreadable, but the calculation behind her voice was unmistakable. "Let's dispense with the theater," she said coolly, her voice carrying a steadiness that felt almost manufactured. "Every single action I took as Attorney General was reviewed, cleared, and filed according to Florida state law. I followed protocol. I served the public. And I will not sit here and be accused of wrongdoing based on innuendo, tabloid headlines, or partisan distortions." She picked up a printed article from the stack before her and held it up as if to prove her point, waving it briefly before setting it down. "These documents presented here today, emails, reports, so-called internal memos, are deeply misleading without context. A meeting with energy executives? That's part of my job. That's how we ensure policy decisions don't destroy jobs or cripple local economies." She looked directly at the committee now, shifting her gaze from left to right, voice hardening with every sentence. "I met with corporations to understand the legal landscape they operated in, not to protect them from it. That's not corruption. That's leadership. And I find it deeply troubling that in an attempt to grandstand, we're now treating lawful governance as if it were criminal misconduct." Her hands rested calmly on the table now, but her tone was edged with contempt. "You can wave donation charts and flash headlines from partisan outlets all day," she added, locking eyes with Jasmine Crockett. "But none of it changes the facts. I was elected to serve Florida. I did. And I will not apologize for choosing economic pragmatism over political spectacle." A tight silence followed. She leaned back slightly in her chair, measured, composed, her lips curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile, as if daring the room to believe that truth was negotiable. But beneath Bondi's calm deflections and carefully polished rhetoric, Jasmine Crockett knew the real story didn't lie in her words. It lay in the paper trail she tried to bury. What began as a quiet scan through routine campaign filings had exploded into a damning mosaic of contradictions. Jasmine's investigative team, composed of 2 forensic accountants, a federal ethics attorney, and a former DOJ analyst, had worked for 3 weeks without sleep cycles, combing through encrypted drives, cross-referencing digital calendars, and chasing down redacted communications through court-ordered disclosures. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. A sequence of emails, meetings, and policy reversals that turned Bondi's defense into a crumbling facade. One email dated August 17, 2015, sent from Bondi's private account to a senior VP at Pinnacle West Developers, read, "I believe we're aligned on the need to protect growth. Let's explore a strategic way to ensure continued collaboration through Q1 of the campaign window." Attached were encrypted calendar links and a preliminary guest list for an invite-only fundraiser, scheduled just 4 days before Bondi's office dropped all charges in a high-profile zoning case involving that very company. The subject line? Compliance and continuity. But what it revealed was anything but lawful. Jasmine didn't reveal it all at once. She let the silence do the heavy lifting. When she finally held up the printed copy in the chamber, the edges still bearing the imprint of the red evidence seal, her voice was low but fire-wrapped. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a transaction. This is what it looks like when the scales of justice are bent to favor power and profit over people." She advanced to the projector and tapped the screen. A timeline appeared, mapping campaign donations against key policy reversals. "This isn't anecdotal," she continued. "This is forensic. Bondi's office met with 5 of the 6 companies that donated over $30,000 within 7 days of each contribution. In every instance, every single one, a regulatory enforcement or legal investigation was withdrawn, delayed, or dismissed entirely." Her voice broke through the murmurs like a hammer. "This is not public service. This is orchestration." Eyes across the chamber narrowed. Even reporters who had come skeptical were now leaning forward, visibly rattled. "We didn't just find smoke," Jasmine said, holding the email aloft. "We found the match, still warm." And just when the email trail seemed damning enough, the next blow didn't come from spreadsheets or signatures, but from voices never meant to be heard. The recordings arrived under a sealed envelope, anonymous, postmarked from Tallahassee. Inside was a flash drive. No label, no note, just data. Jasmine Crockett's team decrypted it in less than an hour. What they uncovered was not speculation, not hearsay, but Bondi's own voice, captured mid-conversation with CEOs of 2 petroleum consortiums and a land development firm under active investigation. In one call, Bondi is heard saying, "Let's make sure enforcement doesn't get ahead of opportunity. I'm on your side. Just keep me updated on PAC positioning." Another recording captured her discussing litigation strategy timelines with chilling clarity. "If we stall through December, you'll be in the clear. We'll make it look procedural." Jasmine didn't hesitate. She scheduled a press conference for the next morning, 10 a.m. sharp, and stood before a sea of microphones, flanked by environmental attorneys, ethics advisors, and 2 parents whose children had suffered chronic illness after toxic dumping near their neighborhood. Jasmine pressed play, and the room stopped breathing. The audio was scratchy but unmistakable. Bondi's cadence, her phrasing, the casual tone of collusion, it filled the air like a confession. The press froze, stunned. Then the questions came, then the outrage. "This isn't just unethical," Jasmine told them, voice hard with fury. "This is the voice of a public official turning her office into a private concierge for corporations accused of poisoning land and air. This is betrayal, digitized, institutional rot, recorded." Within hours, the public response swelled into fury. News networks broke from scheduled coverage. Editorials poured out from the Miami Herald, the Tampa Bay Times, Orlando Sentinel, each demanding immediate accountability. Outside, demonstrators flooded the steps of the Capitol, some holding posters bearing screenshots of Bondi's own words and transcript. "I'm on your side." And the message was loud, unified, unmistakable. Pam Bondi didn't just protect corporations. She partnered with them, while Florida communities paid the price. But as the fury outside swelled and the weight of the evidence closed in, voices echoing through Capitol steps, headlines cascading across cable news, and audio recordings replayed in every newsroom. Pam Bondi did what seasoned power brokers do when the tide threatens to drag them under. She stood her ground and struck back. She leaned forward slowly, both hands braced on the hearing table, her polished nails drumming once against the lacquered wood before she began. The room, which had grown tense under Jasmine Crockett's relentless presentation, now bristled with a different kind of energy, one coiled, defiant, and waiting to see if Bondi would detonate or deflect. Her voice was cold, crisp, and dangerously composed. "With all due respect to this committee," she said, eyes scanning the dais but locking on no one, "I will not sit here in silence while my name is dragged through the mud by baseless allegations and political opportunism." She turned almost slowly to Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett may be comfortable distorting facts for the cameras, but I am not." Her words were clipped, rehearsed, but behind them, tension. "This isn't oversight, it's a circus, and I will not participate in the spectacle of my own vilification." The cameras leaned in. So did the room. She reached for a folder of her own and lifted a stack of papers into view. These so-called leaks that have driven this hearing, the edited clips, the unverified emails, the conveniently timed press releases, have not been authenticated through any credible, neutral process. They are cherry-picked fragments, incomplete, taken out of context, and presented as if they are irrefutable proof of misconduct. Her tone sharpened. "They are not." She allowed just enough of a pause to draw out the drama before continuing. "The recordings you played? I don't deny my voice is on them, but the conclusions drawn from them are speculative at best and dishonest at worst. Yes, I met with industry leaders. Yes, I accepted campaign contributions, within legal limits, fully disclosed. That is not corruption. That is democracy in operation." Then came the pivot, the calculated personal jab. Bondi squared her shoulders and set her hands flat on the desk. "What's happening here is not a search for justice. It's a political hit job." She pointed toward Jasmine, not with a raised finger, but with a slow, deliberate turn of her hand, palm up like a prosecutor exposing motive. "Congresswoman Crockett is not looking for accountability. She's looking for airtime. She's building a platform, not a case." The insult didn't come as a shout. It came as something more dangerous, an accusation dressed in civility. "And if we are going to let leaked conversations, taken out of context, become the new standard for conviction in this chamber, then every public official in America is now at the mercy of selective outrage and opposition research." She paused and breathed, visibly measuring her next words. "This committee wants to know if I use my position to protect corporate interests. My answer is simple. I protected Florida. I protected jobs. I protected the stability of a state economy that depended on responsible industry partnerships. To paint those actions as criminal is not only unfair, it's offensive." Her gaze moved across the room again, now locking briefly with each member of the panel. "I didn't run for office to please activists or newspapers. I ran to keep Florida strong. And I did. Despite the noise, despite the politics, and despite moments like this, when it's easier to tear someone down than to understand the full truth." But what she didn't realize, what became clearer with every word, was that her defenses no longer held the weight they once did. The headlines she claimed were noise had been building for years. Bondi shields developers from investigation. Attorney General intervenes in environmental suit. Emails link Florida AG to donor-funded policy reversals. These were not new accusations. They were patterns. They were signals. And Jasmine had just connected them. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, even Bondi's once confident voice began to sound like someone resisting gravity, speaking louder not to persuade, but to hold ground already crumbling beneath her. But just as Bondi's rebuttal tried to reclaim control, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward again, this time not with theory, not with outrage, but with a weapon no rhetoric could deflect. The sound of Bondi's own voice, captured in a moment of transactional truth. The recording had been buried deep, archived in a server belonging to a defunct political consulting firm flagged only by a stray file name, Call Confidential. Jasmine's team found it during a forensic audit of PAC data and third-party vendor logs. What they heard sent a chill through the room. The call began with standard political pleasantries, references to polling numbers, campaign logistics, even a passing comment about hotel reservations. But then as the tone dropped, so did the mask. In crystal-clear audio, Pam Bondi's voice came through. Look, if we can lock in support before Q3, I can guarantee that enforcement won't escalate beyond administrative review. No headlines, no court. You'll have room to breathe. The man on the other end, later identified as the chief legal officer of PetroSouth Energy, replied affirmatively. Then came her follow-up. But I need full PAC alignment. I'm not taking half measures this cycle. There was no ambiguity, no spin. It was a direct ask for campaign support, paired with a veiled assurance that legal consequences would be softened in return. When Jasmine played that clip before the hearing chamber, the effect was immediate. The room fell into a tension so sharp it felt surgical. Gone was the noise, the political grandstanding. Only breathless silence remained, the kind reserved for when truth can no longer be denied. Crockett didn't shout. She didn't pace. She simply turned from the speaker and faced the room, letting the moment settle. What you just heard, she said, voice low and deliberate, is the sound of justice being priced, the sound of a public office used not to uphold the law, but to suppress it in favor of private wealth. Behind her, a slide lit up with internal memos from the Department of Environmental Protection, investigations into PetroSouth's waste disposal practices that had been abruptly closed just weeks after the date of that call. Maps followed, color-coded to show spikes in chemical-related illness in the surrounding communities. Red clusters dotted poor neighborhoods, children, seniors, entire families living within poisoned soil. This wasn't a misstep, Jasmine continued, voice tightening. This was architecture. Bondi's office didn't just ignore violations. They neutralized them, and in return, her campaign coffers swelled. She tapped the screen. Financial records appeared. $85,000 from 3 PACs linked to PetroSouth, funneled through cutout committees and routed within 11 days of the recorded call. This isn't circumstantial, she said. This is cause and effect. Cold, traceable, and criminal in implication. The air in the chamber was suffocating. Members of the Oversight Committee exchanged grim glances. Bondi stared ahead, lips drawn thin, but said nothing. And for a moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that the foundation of her defense had cracked, not from speculation, not from opinion, but from a voice she could never deny, her own. And just as the weight of Bondi's recorded voice threatened to collapse whatever remained of her defense, the shadows moved. The pushback didn't come with flashing headlines or televised rebuttals. It came quietly, strategically, through the veins of power that stretched far beyond the hearing room. At 2:13 a.m., Jasmine Crockett's chief counsel received an encrypted message from a known Capitol liaison. Governor's office concerned about institutional fallout. Recommend de-escalation. Delay vote. By dawn, 3 separate congressional aides confirmed that calls were coming in from high-ranking state officials and federal liaisons, not to dispute the evidence, but to question the wisdom of continuing. The language was polished but unmistakable. Is this really worth tearing the system down? Suddenly, neutral committee members were being invited to off-record briefings with industry-funded legal consultants. Talking points began circulating, identical phrases repeating across news outlets and morning op-eds. Due process must not be sacrificed for political spectacle. Oversight must be fair, not vengeful. Florida needs stability now, not retribution. It was coordination masquerading as concern, and Jasmine recognized it instantly for what it was. Institutional protectionism designed to fracture the truth before it reached the finish line. By the end of the week, pressure turned public. Senator Caldwell of Florida, a longtime ally of Bondi and recipient of over $100,000 in oil and gas PAC money, released a statement condemning the hearing as a thinly veiled character assault by radicals seeking headlines. He wasn't alone. A block of state legislators, many tied to the same corporations now implicated in the environmental cover-ups, began demanding an immediate halt to the proceedings. One lawmaker even introduced a symbolic resolution urging Congress to cease its harassment of Florida officials acting in good faith. Subpoenas were challenged. Hearings were delayed. Budget lines for Crockett's investigative team were flagged for re-examination. Behind closed doors, committee chairs received private visits from donors and former governors, urging them to rein it in. The implication wasn't subtle. Let this go, or feel the system turn against you. Jasmine Crockett stood in the eye of it, undeterred but increasingly isolated. Her inbox flooded with veiled warnings. Careful who you target. These people don't fall, they bury. Anonymous mailers appeared in her home district with lines like, "Does Crockett serve justice or her own ambition?" Networks that once championed her resolve now hedged their coverage, questioning the partisanship of her pursuit. But none of it surprised her, because this wasn't the first time power had wrapped itself in legality to silence truth. It was a well-rehearsed defense mechanism of the political elite. When one of their own was exposed, the system didn't break. It closed ranks. And yet Crockett pressed forward, her voice growing sharper, her pace steadier. "If justice depends on how many allies you have in back rooms," she told reporters in front of the Capitol, "then what we're defending isn't democracy, it's a theater of privilege." Her words didn't echo. They landed. Because in that moment, everyone watching, whether from the chamber, the streets, or their screens, understood what was unfolding. This wasn't just about Pam Bondi anymore. It was about the invisible network that held her up. And Jasmine Crockett was not just pulling at one thread, she was unraveling the whole design. And as Crockett's calm dismantling of the power structure echoed through the chamber, Bondi reached once more for the defense that had long protected her. The claim that legality alone absolved intent. Her voice was firmer now, louder than before, tinged not just with frustration, but with something nearing desperation. "I'm not going to stand here and let my record be distorted by someone with a personal vendetta," she began, eyes narrowing at Jasmine Crockett across the aisle. "Every decision I made as Attorney General was lawful, backed by policy, and supported by our economic advisors. You call it favoritism, I call it stability. Florida's economy depends on private industry. These corporations provide employment, infrastructure, and investment. If I worked with them, if I met with their legal teams, if I ensured regulations were reasonable, it was to preserve jobs and avoid government overreach. That is not corruption. That is leadership." Her words hung in the air, tight and defensive. "And what you're doing, Congresswoman, turning this hearing into a spectacle, that's not oversight. That's political theater, and it's beneath this chamber." Jasmine stood motionless for a moment, then calmly approached the center of the room like a surgeon returning to the table, scalpel in hand. She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. "You keep saying legal, as if the law were a shield so wide it can block out the sun." She lifted a stack of reports, her fingertips stained slightly with the ink from late-night analysis. "Let's talk about your record, Ms. Bondi. 18 major corporations, all with open investigations, all quietly settled or dismissed under your administration. You call that lawful, but these settlements were sealed. The public never knew the terms, never saw the evidence, never heard from the victims." She walked over to the projector, clicked once. The screen lit up with names: Petro South, Bayline Properties, Meridian Pharma. Each of these companies had legal exposure, from environmental violations to housing fraud. Each one funneled money into passies tied to your campaign, and each one walked away clean. She turned to face Bondi directly. "So you say this is about jobs, about economic necessity. But who decides whose livelihoods matter more? The developer expanding into flood zones, or the families drowning because zoning laws were rewritten behind closed doors? The chemical company donating to your PAC, or the school children coughing up blood because their playground sits next to an unregulated disposal site?" She paused, eyes locked. "This isn't theater. This is a reckoning." For years, Bondi had used that same refrain: legality as armor, prosperity as excuse. In 2016, she justified her refusal to join the multi-state opioid lawsuits by citing uncertain legal standing and economic risk. In 2017, when environmental groups begged her office to investigate illegal dumping by a major plastics firm, she declined, citing insufficient public interest. Each time she emerged untouched, but not this time, not here, because this was no longer about technicalities. It was about the moral architecture of power. And Jasmine Crockett was tearing the scaffolding down, one contradiction at a time. And just as Bondi tried to steady herself behind the mask of legalese and economic justification, Jasmine Crockett made her final move. Not with rage, but with ruthless precision that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. She stepped toward the center of the chamber with a silence so focused it pulled the room inward. In her hands was a sealed evidence pouch marked with a black tag, its contents reviewed, verified, and authorized for public disclosure. "This," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "is the last file you hoped would never see the light of day." She laid it on the table, unsealed it calmly, and drew out a series of printed emails, one by one, laying them before the committee like weapons being unsheathed. The room fell deathly still. Cameras zoomed, brows furrowed. Jasmine nodded to the technician near the monitor. A massive screen behind her flickered to life. The first slide displayed an internal email dated March 18, 2016, from a senior executive at Horizon Petrocorp to Pam Bondi's personal campaign assistant. Subject line: preliminary offer for continued protection. The language was coded but unmistakable. Promises of campaign donations tied directly to the halting of legal action related to drilling violations in coastal wetlands. Jasmine let the silence hang a moment longer before switching to the next, a scanned transcript from a recorded call between Bondi and the CEO of Silverline Properties, a major real estate developer previously under federal investigation. "We'll take care of your problem," Bondi's voice said in the clip, "but I need your people on board for November." The final item was a Department of Justice visitor log, doctored but digitally restored, revealing a secret meeting at 11:47 p.m. in Tallahassee between Bondi and 3 oil lobbyists, none of whom were listed in official disclosures. By now, even Bondi's defenders were shifting in their seats. She reached for her mic again, but her words stumbled against the weight of what was unfolding. Those communications were never verified." Jasmine didn't let her finish. "They were verified by 3 independent forensic teams," she said, without raising her voice. "Every timestamp, every routing address, every audio frequency. These are not rumors. They are records. And these records expose a pattern of intentional deception and strategic suppression of public interest cases in exchange for political cash." What followed wasn't chaos. It was a kind of stunned paralysis. Members of the committee sat frozen. Outside, the hallway monitors broadcast the live feed to packed press corridors where reporters exchanged frantic whispers and watched their phones light up with alerts. Online, the fallout was immediate. Bondi betrayal surged to the top of every trending list. Environmental groups began issuing public letters demanding retroactive legal review of every case dismissed under Bondi's term. Constituents who once voted for her flooded the congressional hotline with voicemails laced with fury and disbelief. And for Bondi, there was no prepared script left. No index card could outmaneuver what the room now knew. She wasn't simply accused, she was cornered. What had begun as a routine congressional oversight hearing had turned into something seismic. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed corruption, she had unearthed the blueprint of an entire political machine engineered to shield profit at the cost of truth. And the wreckage now lay bare, undeniable and documented, beneath the glare of a nation finally paying attention. And as the chamber emptied, its walls still echoing with the fallout of truth laid bare, the tremors didn't stop. They spread like ripples through the Capitol, striking offices where deals were once struck behind closed doors, rattling the desks of those who'd quietly protected Bondi for years. Jasmine Crockett stood by the marble columns, her fingers still curled from gripping the folder that detonated Bondi's defenses. The hearing was over, but the war was only beginning. It started with whispers, as most revolutions do, an urgent hallway conversation between Senator Grace Montclair of Oregon and Representative Lucas Klein of Illinois. Neither were known for dramatics, but today their tone was different, raw, precise, and edged with moral exhaustion. "This isn't a scandal," Klein murmured. "This is architecture. It was built to shield her." Grace didn't hesitate. "Then it's time to dismantle the whole structure." Within 30 minutes, a formal motion was drafted and submitted to the Office of Congressional Ethics, co-signed by 17 members from both parties. The language was direct and lethal. "We, the undersigned, request an immediate, independent federal investigation into the political conduct of former Florida Attorney General Pamela Jo Bondi on the basis of probable abuse of power, coordinated obstruction of justice, and solicitation of unlawful corporate influence." News outlets got wind of it before the ink dried. CNN interrupted its regular programming with a banner that read, "Breaking official investigation requested into Pam Bondi's corporate ties." Fox scrambled to reframe the story, but couldn't deny the weight of the evidence. MSNBC brought in former federal prosecutors who spoke with unnerving calm. "This is bigger than a failed hearing. It's the beginning of a reckoning." Across the nation, the public response surged like a breached dam. Activist groups reactivated dormant petitions. College students held flash rallies in Gainesville, Tampa, and Houston. One sign summed it all up in 6 brutal words: "She sold us to the highest bidder." But as the machinery of oversight began to churn, not everyone celebrated. In back rooms and secure email threads, high-ranking officials who had once donated to or coordinated with Bondi began their own quiet calculations. Some deleted records, some lawyered up, and a few, sensing the heat rising, tried to distance themselves publicly. Senator Morris Heller, who'd previously praised Bondi's pro-business courage, now released a vague statement about welcoming transparency. But Jasmine saw through it. She always did. Inside the Oversight and Government Reform Committee's war room, Jasmine and her team mapped the next phase. The evidence she'd exposed wasn't just damning, it was trail-marked. For every corporate favor, there was a corresponding donation, policy memo, or legal dismissal. Now, with the formal request submitted, federal oversight bodies, the Office of Inspector General, the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, and the Federal Election Commission were on alert. The committee's senior counsel leaned over a stack of files, tapping a photo of Bondi shaking hands with the CEO of Aegis Oil beneath the words "Post-Litigation Celebration Dinner." "They're going to come for you," he warned Jasmine quietly. "Power like this never goes down without clawing back." Jasmine didn't flinch. She was already preparing her next public statement, aware that from here on out, everything would escalate. "Let them come," she replied. "This isn't about political vengeance. This is about the contract every official signs with the people when they swear to serve." She broke it. They watched her break it. And now we'll find out who helped her sweep up the glass. Meanwhile, in downtown Washington, agents from the DOJ's Integrity Unit began requesting internal documents from Bondi's tenure, previously shielded under administrative privilege, now subject to subpoena. A closed-door emergency meeting was held at the Federal Election Commission, where financial analysts examined the donation flows from 2013 to 2017, cross-referencing them with litigation patterns, court decisions, and lobbying logs. "It's a pattern," one analyst whispered, "and if the data confirms it, she's not just exposed, she's indictable." That word, indictable, spread like wildfire through DC's legal circles. Law professors took to Twitter, breaking down the statute under 18 U.S. Code Section 201. If prosecutors can prove that official acts were exchanged for campaign donations or favorable treatment, one thread explained, Bondi could face criminal charges for bribery, honest services fraud, and conspiracy. The stakes had shifted from career damage to potential prosecution. Bondi, who had once strutted through press briefings with blinding confidence, now retreated into silence. Her office issued a 2-sentence statement: "Ms. Bondi maintains her innocence and will not dignify politically motivated attacks with further comment." But no one believed silence would protect her now. Back in the Capitol, Jasmine looked out over the evening skyline, the dome glowing behind tinted windows. Her team buzzed around her, typing, coordinating with ethics officials, reviewing the legal scope of the probe. But for a moment, she allowed herself stillness. She remembered every slammed door from 5 years ago. Every time she tried to raise concerns and been told to wait, to be patient, to not rock the boat. And now the boat was listing. Still, this wasn't vindication. Not yet. Investigations are slow. Powerful people stall. Evidence is buried. And already rumors circled of Bondi allies trying to get the Justice Department to delay subpoenas under procedural review. Jasmine expected it. The corruption she had spent months unraveling didn't collapse in one hearing. It mutated, adapted, regrouped. But this time, it would be met with sunlight, not silence. As the clock neared midnight, Jasmine called for one final briefing. Her voice, though tired, didn't waver. The evidence is undeniable. The calls were recorded, the emails were real, the patterns are documented, and the public's watching. She paused, meeting the eyes of her team. Now we finish what we started. But as the investigation took on a life of its own, branching into agencies, subpoenas, and media exposés, it was the next day's return to the hearing room that would become history. The mood was no longer speculative, it was surgical. Jasmine Crockett walked into the chamber like a trial surgeon, her hands steady, her pace unhurried, her eyes burning with restrained fury. Across the aisle sat Pam Bondi, paler than usual, lips tightened into an unreadable line, her attorneys whispering urgently behind her. The cameras were back, so were the protesters outside. But inside, only the truth would echo loud enough to shatter careers. Crockett opened the final session, not with a flourish, but with a scalpel. Yesterday, we initiated the machinery of oversight. Today, we return to the roots, the evidence that brought us here. The calls, the emails, the patterns of privilege and betrayal. She raised her hand, and her team projected a full-size transcript of a call between Bondi and the CEO of Meridian Energy onto the hearing wall. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In this recording, dated April 17, 2016, Ms. Bondi can be heard assuring the executive that her office would ensure procedural delay in exchange for coordinated campaign support. These are her words, not ours, not conjecture. Bondi's head lowered slightly. She didn't reach for the mic. Then came the visual timeline, a digital red thread linking campaign contributions to legal delays, dropped lawsuits, and confidential dinners. One after another, Jasmine unraveled them. Emails with vague subject lines like follow-up on joint strategy that, when decrypted, read more like negotiation memos than official correspondence. The room fell into stunned stillness. No interruptions, no coughs, just the raw clatter of truth knocking over every excuse. At one point, Jasmine turned directly toward Bondi and asked, "Do you deny that this meeting occurred at the Four Seasons Hotel, 8:03 p.m., June 9th, 2015? Bondi opened her mouth, but no words came out. Bondi's defenders tried to pivot, to question the integrity of the sources, the chain of custody, the translation, but every line of attack had already been preempted. Jasmine didn't just anticipate pushback, she welcomed it. You ask for authentication? Here are the original WAV files, metadata, and timestamps. You ask for credibility? The whistleblower is a former chief of staff in Bondi's own office, testifying under oath. Her delivery remained cold and crystalline, not because she lacked emotion, but because fury, when forged into precision, becomes undeniable. As Crockett laid out the final document, a legal opinion drafted but never submitted, containing language directly lifted from an oil lobby's internal strategy memo, a collective breath was held. She didn't just show that Bondi was compromised. She showed the process by which law had been re-engineered to serve industry over citizens. This is no longer about one official, Jasmine said slowly. This is about the ecosystem of collusion. But we begin where the rot is most visible. Pam Bondi's response was a study in collapse. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's. Her attorneys had ceased whispering. A bottle of water sat untouched at her elbow. When the committee chairman asked if she had any closing statement, she leaned forward, but the microphone didn't catch her voice. She reached for it again, cleared her throat. These allegations, she said hoarsely, are political warfare disguised as oversight. But there was no weight behind the words. Not anymore. Her voice trembled, and in that flicker of vulnerability, the whole room sensed the crumbling of her armor. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. She pulled out a final file, thinner than the rest but sharper in its impact. "This," she said, holding up a single-page email marked "Confidential," was forwarded by Bondi's personal assistant to her private server, then deleted. "It includes direct coordination on delaying enforcement penalties for 3 companies, all of which donated to her super PAC within 6 weeks. This isn't politics. It's pay for play, and it ends now." Reporters scrambled to transcribe. Aides whispered into Bluetooth headsets. And outside the chamber, the crowd gathered in silence, watching the live feed on jumbotrons. As Jasmine sat down, her face solemn, the room remained suspended in tension. Then the committee chairman, a former federal judge himself, leaned into his mic and declared, "Based on the documentation and testimony presented during these proceedings, this committee will refer Ms. Pamela Bondi for formal criminal investigation under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 201 and Section 1001, covering bribery and false statements to a federal body." Gasps filled the gallery. Bondi's lawyers objected immediately, but the decision was made. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She just leaned forward, folded her hands, and whispered something only her chief of staff heard. "One truth is enough to start a landslide." And across the country, that landslide had already begun. In Miami, a local environmental advocacy group launched a new campaign titled "Justice Before Oil." In Portland, students organized a national teach-in on political corruption. And in Washington, legal analysts predicted that the Bondi case could open a precedent for holding other attorneys general accountable for hidden corporate ties. The headlines were relentless. Bondi cornered, justice strikes back. Crockett's moment of reckoning. In that hearing room, under the gaze of history and the weight of a nation long manipulated, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a confrontation. She forced a reckoning that exposed the machinery of power, tore down its facade, and reminded the American people what courage looks like in the face of institutional rot. The hearing room emptied, but the aftershock had just begun. What Jasmine Crockett ignited inside the Capitol walls was no longer a mere congressional dispute. It was now a political detonation rolling through every power corridor in D.C. As cameras shut off and reporters scrambled for satellite vans, a single question gripped the nation. What happens now to Pam Bondi? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the committee's formal referral, government watchdogs launched immediate ethics inquiries, and federal prosecutors convened a pre-grand jury session behind closed doors. Then, without warning, the Florida Office of Executive Affairs released a terse, 7-line statement. Effective immediately, Pamela Bondi is relieved of all duties and advisory positions in relation to public policy and state representation. No ceremony, no press conference, just a severed cord cut clean under the weight of undeniable truth. Jasmine's evidence hadn't just exposed corruption, it forced consequences. Bondi's world collapsed with brutal efficiency. First came the revocation of her national security clearance, a symbolic dagger for someone who once prided herself as a guardian of constitutional integrity. Then the U.S. Bar Association placed her license under emergency review. Within 48 hours, the university board where she sat as trustee voted unanimously to suspend her. News helicopters circled her Tampa residence like vultures, while protesters outside held signs that read, "Not above the law," and "Corporate servants deserve no sanctuary." Her name, once hailed in conservative circles, had become radioactive. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, said little. She returned to her office, ignored the barrage of interview requests, and focused instead on writing a letter to the Justice Department, urging expedited legal proceedings. But her silence carried more weight than any podium address. She had done what few thought possible, dismantled a political titan, not with rage or spectacle, but with patience, documentation, and relentless clarity. And yet, as headlines roared her name across the country, she refused to bask in it. "This wasn't about me," she told her team in a quiet debriefing. "This was about the people who got crushed while no one was looking." Bondi tried to push back. Her legal team issued statements calling the decision political theater and accused Crockett of waging a vendetta disguised as justice. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Social media turned savage. Hashtags like Bondi Out and Justice Crockett trended in over a dozen states. Investigative podcasts dissected her financial records, real estate holdings, and archived communications. On national television, former allies distanced themselves in real time. One senator awkwardly told CNN, "I supported Bondi's legal mind, not her alleged behavior. There's a difference." By the end of the week, Bondi's influence had shriveled into a footnote of disgrace. The corporations she once shielded issued vague apologies and pledged compliance reforms. Her consulting contracts vanished. Invitations to conferences and panels were rescinded. In an especially humiliating twist, a think tank that once celebrated her unwavering commitment to constitutional ethics removed her from their website, replacing her bio with a single line, "Position vacated." But even as Bondi faded from the stage, Jasmine Crockett understood the real fight had just begun. Because Bondi was never the disease, only the symptom. The corruption ran deeper, and the next battle would be against the institutions that enabled her, silenced whistleblowers, and allowed a public office to become a private asset for corporate manipulation. Jasmine knew the machine wasn't broken. It was operating exactly as designed. That's what made it so dangerous. Still, in that moment, when the formal letter of dismissal was read aloud by the Oversight Committee's chair, there was an electric sense of vindication. Jasmine sat still, eyes closed, lips pressed together, not smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She was remembering. Remembering the victims of environmental collapse in Louisiana, whose cases Bondi ignored, the teachers whose pensions were sacrificed for energy subsidies, the young activists she met outside her office, holding handwritten signs begging for someone, anyone, to listen. Now the nation had listened. Pam Bondi, once untouchable, now faced potential federal charges of bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of public office. And this time, there were no backroom deals, no protective phone calls from political allies, no quiet transfers to think tanks, only the weight of evidence and the voice of a congresswoman who refused to flinch. It didn't happen in one headline. It didn't need to. The collapse of Pam Bondi's political career wasn't marked by a single explosion. It was a slow, merciless implosion, televised and tweeted, hour by hour. The same networks that once praised her as Florida's iron spine now dissected her every move with forensic glee. Morning anchors used words like betrayal, greed, and deception with a confidence that hadn't existed just days before. One panelist on MSNBC didn't even hesitate. "Pam Bondi's career is over. Not paused, finished." The fallout swept through every layer of American political discourse like a firestorm. Online, number "Bondi sold us out" trended above sports, music, even global news. Her official accounts were flooded, not with threats, but with bitter disappointment. Teachers asked why she undercut environmental lawsuits that protected their students. Cancer survivors demanded to know why she blocked legislation tied to clean water. Young voters, many of whom once saw her as a conservative role model, posted side-by-side clips of her public oaths and the leaked recordings Jasmine Crockett unveiled. Each contradiction more damning than the last. And then came the cancellations. One by one, political allies deleted her from public memory. A scheduled keynote speech at the National Conservative Forum was pulled without comment. A university rescinded her honorary degree. A corporate PAC that once donated to her legal defense fund issued a statement reading, "We no longer align with the values demonstrated by Ms. Bondi's conduct." It was more than reputational damage. It was erasure. Her legacy wasn't just in flames. It had been condemned. For Jasmine Crockett, the silence that followed the storm was deafening. She had stared down a political Goliath, not with theatrics, but with facts. Cross-referenced documents, timed audio, recorded calls, even timestamps on meeting logs. The country didn't watch her scream. They watched her prove. And that, perhaps, is what made Bondi's downfall so irreversible. There was no room for narrative manipulation. No political spin that could survive Crockett's quiet relentlessness. Bondi tried to fight back, issuing a tearful video plea filmed from her private residence, framed in front of family photos and an American flag. "This is not justice," she said, voice cracking. "This is persecution. But the public didn't bite. The comments were brutal. You lied to our faces. You sold out for oil money. You could have saved lives and you chose profit. Even longtime political pundits began rewriting the narrative. One Fox News commentator, who had defended Bondi for years, opened his segment with a confession. I got it wrong. We all did. Think tanks purged her papers. Editorial boards that once cited her rulings now questioned how much of her legal strategy had been sponsored. Newspapers from the Tampa Bay Times to the New York Times ran parallel headlines. The Fall of Pam Bondi, the same headline coast to coast in fonts bold enough to bleed off the page. But perhaps the most striking reaction came not from the elite, but from the streets. In Miami, Tampa, and Tallahassee, spontaneous candlelight vigils were held, not in honor of Bondi, but in memory of the environmental victims whose cases she buried. Names of poisoned communities were chanted in unison. Images of wetlands destroyed, court rulings suppressed, and whistleblowers ignored were projected onto public buildings. One mother held a sign that read, "My son drank that water." Now she wants forgiveness. Bondi's legal team scrambled. Lawsuits loomed on multiple fronts, from federal investigators, environmental watchdogs, even former colleagues seeking to distance themselves through civil action. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained composed, refusing to gloat or indulge in spectacle. Her only public comment during the chaos was a single sentence delivered outside the Capitol. This was never about one woman. This was about accountability, no matter the name. That line echoed in classrooms, on podcasts, in campaign ads for other candidates suddenly emboldened to speak against corporate collusion. Pam Bondi had become a case study, not just in corruption, but in what happens when public trust reaches its breaking point. And unlike past scandals that slowly faded behind new headlines, this one persisted. Why? Because it hit the rawest nerve in American politics, the betrayal of the people by the very ones sworn to protect them. Even late-night hosts, often hesitant to dig into deep policy, couldn't ignore the drama. One viral segment featured Jasmine's committee speech intercut with footage of Bondi at corporate galas, overlaid with a slow, cinematic score. The punchline? A moment of stunned silence, then applause. The audience wasn't laughing. They were grieving. This wasn't comedy. It was catharsis. Months later, Bondi's name still evoked visceral reactions. In an exit poll conducted in Florida, 76% of respondents said they felt betrayed by her handling of environmental and corporate lawsuits. 54% believe she should be permanently barred from public office. And perhaps most devastating of all, her own party wouldn't return her calls. One staffer at a conservative super PAC leaked a text that read, "She's politically toxic, let her drown." And she did, quietly, painfully, under the weight of her own choices. There were no parades for Jasmine Crockett, no book deals, no magazine covers. Just a swelling sense across the country that something important had happened. That for once, a politician had stood her ground against corruption, and the system, though battered, had responded. Barely, but it had. And Pam Bondi, her legacy was rewritten not by her enemies, but by the people she failed. And as the dust finally settled from Bondi's fall, one truth remained, impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived the storm, she had become the storm. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the chamber, this time not as the interrogator, but as the architect of something greater, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the roar of victory that followed her. It was the silence of recognition. Lawmakers who once side-eyed her with doubt now straightened in their seats. Journalists whispered her name like a headline already writing itself. And in every corner of the nation, from rural school boards to bustling city halls, her face had become something more than familiar. It had become symbolic. This was no longer just about Bondi. It was about the machinery that enabled her, the quiet deals, the campaign donations with strings attached, the meetings behind closed doors that shaped policy in shadows. Jasmine Crockett stood in the ruins of all that deceit and declared, not with arrogance, but with purpose, "This ends now." Not just this one scandal, the entire culture that bred it. And she meant it. She introduced the Public Integrity and Transparency Act on live television. Its pages heavy with clauses that made lobbyists wince and career politicians squirm. Full disclosure of campaign contributions above $1,000. Mandatory public records of meetings between officials and corporate representatives. Severe penalties for those who used office to protect private gain over public good. It wasn't just legislation, it was a weapon aimed at the status quo. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She called for the creation of an independent anti-corruption task force, staffed not by political appointees but by legal scholars, retired judges, investigative journalists, and citizen watchdogs. No party loyalty, no corporate ties, just one mission: to audit and expose. And the public responded, not with skepticism, but with a hunger that had been buried under decades of broken promises. Within 48 hours, her proposal had over 5 million digital signatures. Town halls overflowed with people demanding reform. Local officials were inundated with calls. Where do you stand on Crockett's bill? School teachers made lesson plans around the hearing. Civics teachers printed her closing statements. One high school in Detroit even renamed their student court simulation the Jasmine Protocol. In Washington, resistance came hard and fast. Old guard politicians accused her of starting a witch hunt. News anchors loyal to corporate interests labeled her a populist bomb thrower. But the attacks only sharpened her resolve. Because behind every smear campaign, behind every editor's scornful monologue, was fear. They feared what she represented, a line in the sand. And Jasmine made that line deeper with every passing day. She held a press conference in front of the Capitol steps. No teleprompter, no scripted applause. Just her voice and the truth. This is not about vengeance, she said. It's about repair. It's about the child whose water turned brown because someone signed a deal in secret. It's about the grandmother whose prescriptions skyrocketed because someone in power got paid to look away. And it's about making sure you don't get lied to again. The camera zoomed in on her eyes. Not angry, not smug, just unyielding. The next morning, Crockett Revolution trended globally. From Sydney to Sao Paulo, news outlets covered her speech as a global call for democratic renewal. Even in Europe, activists cited her proposals as models for rebuilding civic trust. The Senate held its breath when the bill reached the floor. Lobbyists spent millions trying to sink it quietly, but the noise outside wouldn't stop. Crowds filled the National Mall with posters that read, "Jasmine's law equals our shield, and no more hidden hands." Former government workers came forward to testify. Environmental lawyers, teachers, whistleblowers, all had stories, all had waited for a champion, and Jasmine listened. For her, this wasn't a moment to savor. It was a duty that came with scars. Death threats became routine. Security followed her everywhere. Her family was harassed. Anonymous op-eds questioned her background, her motives, even her mental state. But through it all, she kept walking into that chamber, heels clicking like gunshots on marble. Then the day came, the vote. On the floor of the House, the clerk's voice rang out, name by name, vote by vote. It was close, tense, too close. A single no too many, and the entire dream would collapse. Jasmine sat still, lips pressed, eyes fixed, not on the tally board, but on the faces of her colleagues. Were they about to let history pass them by? And then the final vote. 218, yes. 214, no. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Then came the applause. Not wild, not jubilant, respectful. The kind of applause you hear at the end of a hard-fought war. The kind that means something sacred just happened. Jasmine rose slowly, almost reluctantly. Her hands didn't rise in triumph. They curled into fists by her side. She looked around at the room, not for praise, but for accountability. And then she spoke one final sentence. Let this be the last time corruption hides behind a badge or a title. That single sentence was clipped, quoted, taught. Colleges played it in government ethics classes. Documentaries ended with it. Protesters carried it on cardboard signs. It was translated into Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic, Russian. It was inscribed into the foundation of a new era in American politics. Bondi had become the cautionary tale, but Jasmine was the blueprint. In the months that followed, legislation modeled on her bill passed in over a dozen states. Watchdog organizations saw their funding quadruple. Media outlets launched new bureaus focused entirely on transparency. Even those who once opposed her began to echo her rhetoric in speeches of their own. The tide had shifted, and it bore her name. But in the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for monuments. She didn't run victory tours or pen memoirs, at least not yet. She returned to her district, held a listening session in a dusty auditorium, and looked every constituent in the eye. "I work for you, not corporations, not parties. You." A child in the front row raised her hand. "Are you going to fix everything?" Jasmine smiled, weary but hopeful. "Not everything," she said, "but enough to make sure you never have to ask that question again." And as the crowd dispersed and the headlines shifted to other battles, one question lingered in the silence Jasmine left behind. What, after all the smoke and fury, was the human cost of standing for truth? The real lesson didn't lie in the bill passed or the votes counted. It lived in the quiet toll etched into Jasmine Crockett's face. This wasn't just a political victory. It was a war of soul, a daily choice to walk straight into rooms where she knew she'd be outnumbered, underestimated, and strategically undermined. She'd been called arrogant, unstable, even dangerous. But each insult became armor, each betrayal, fuel. In exposing the machinery of corruption, she exposed something deeper, that justice isn't forged in comfort. It's carved from pain. The lesson was never about punishing one woman like Bondi. It was about proving that no one, no matter how powerful, should be immune to consequence. And it was about showing that integrity doesn't come from having nothing to lose. It comes from choosing to lose everything and still telling the truth. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.